This is Terms of Reference Podcast number 167.
If you look at the poor, for instance, and I'm talking across consumers as well as merchants, they disproportionately bear the cost of cash. In addition, the massive kind of opportunity here is the second phase of this, which is using digital to access broader financial services. If you're doing transactions, you're doing cash transactions today, and if you can digitize those transactions, they can actually help you get underwritten for a loan. And that loan can, if you're a merchant, it can help you buy more inventory and turn that inventory and grow your business. And therefore, if you're a consumer, you can get access to credit, insurance, etc.
This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. I know that I take for granted that I'm able to perform financial transactions around the world via a multitude of channels, essentially anytime I want. In fact, only because of my lifestyle. My biggest headache comes from a banking system in the United States that often flags my non-US transactions as suspect for fraud. Today's episode is about how we can take a look at individuals and businesses on the other side of that coin. Yes, another wonderful pun. I'm referring to the vast majority of people who operate exclusively with cash, are unbanked, and have little of any real access to credit. These individuals are not included in the efficiencies and benefits of the digital economy, and the gap only gets more difficult to bridge as time presses on. My guest today for the 167th Terms of Reference podcast is Badal Malick. Badal is the CEO of Catalyst, an organization focused on helping India's small businesses and low-income consumers unlock the power of digital payments to gain access to broader financial services and create opportunities vital to their future prosperity. This is a fantastic discussion about financial inclusion, where we cover both the size and chicken and egg nature of the problem, the four-part solution Catalyst is implementing, why financial inclusion is a potential game changer for so many, and much more. I spoke with Badal in New Delhi. But before we get started, a quick word from our sponsor.
The Terms of Reference podcast is sponsored by International Solutions Group, helping to improve the social impact of governments, UN agencies, NGOs, and companies for more than 10 years. Visit ISG online at www.theisg.com.
Hello, Badal. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hi, Stephen. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Badal, where do we find you sitting today?
I am sitting in New Delhi, India.
All right. And what's the weather like, sort of the end of July in 2017 in New Delhi today?
Yeah, no, it's a rainy monsoon day, and I think it rained during the afternoon. I haven't stepped out, so I don't know. I'll find out soon.
Excellent. You haven't stepped outside because you're so intensely, engaged in your organization. It's a surprisingly new organization, as we were talking before the show. But you're the CEO of an organization called Catalyst, and you're focused on essentially financial inclusion through digital payments. But, let you introduce your organization and tell us what's your focus and how you're trying to work.
Sure. So, I always struggle with this question because I don't really think that there is an easy benchmark. And hopefully, through this conversation, that will become clearer. But our mission, Stephen, is to create or to help build an inclusive digital economy or a financial ecosystem that meets the needs of all Indians. What we do is we apply an ecosystem approach to digital payments and beyond. And what I mean by that is that digital payments, the way we see it, is a means to an end. So digital payments enables low-income consumers, small merchants, suppliers to get onto a platform that then gives them access to much broader financial services, be it credit, insurance, pension, etc., and kind of participate in the inclusive digital economy. Ultimately, sort of be able to kind of increase their own prosperity and security.
I think most of our listeners would probably agree immediately, hey, financial inclusion is a huge issue. It's something that's important. Are you able to sort of give us an idea of the size of the problem in India or wrap our heads around why this is such an important issue for you to be focusing on?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So India, is a country of 1.1 billion, roughly. If you think of that, we have 50 million, quote unquote, MSMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. And just about 2% of them accept digitally, right? So the challenge is enormous. At the same time, what's at stake is huge because we have a poor population. We look at urban, if you look at, the bottom 80, the bottom 80% of India, they are largely cash driven. unconnected and therefore, kind of bear direct as well as indirect costs. And so the challenge is, really enormous in terms of scale. The challenge is the opportunity, but it's enormous in terms of scale, but also enormous in terms of the behavioral challenge, which is to move what has been endemic or a very cash-based system, because a lot of these folks have been on cash for donkey's years, to drive a digital transformation.
So give me some insight as to why this is important to you. I mean, you're the CEO of this organization. Before our interview here, we were doing a little warm up and you were saying, we're not really in the development business. We're not here because that's what our staff haven't signed up to do that. They're here to solve a problem. How are you approaching that? Is there a personal attachment that you have that got you into this, or maybe some of your staff, or why was this the problem for you to solve?
No, absolutely. So we see this as a massive problem statement, and we're driven by kind of applying creative solutions to problems. And it's a big problem because, like for some of the reasons I mentioned, I think that, there are, just from the standpoint of, financial inclusion, there are direct benefits to be had, right? So if you look at the poor, for instance, and I'm talking across consumers as well as merchants, they disproportionately bear the cost of cash, right? So whether it's leakage, theft, coping costs of cash, etc., all of those are, disproportionately borne by poor people. In addition, the massive kind of opportunity here is the second phase of this, which is, kind of using digital to access broader financial services, like I said. So, if you're doing transactions, you're doing cash transactions today, and if you can digitize those transactions, they can actually help you get underwritten for, a loan. And that loan can, if you're a merchant, it can help you buy more inventory and turn that inventory and grow your business. And therefore, if you're a consumer, it can, again, you can get access to credit, insurance, etc. that provides more prosperity and security to your family. So ultimately, it is linked to aspirations. And so that's what excites us about this. I come from a fintech background. A lot of our, team here comes from varied, public as well as private sector backgrounds, and have, done a lot of very interesting and creative things. And we have the other thing that is important here is that we have a very unique approach to this problem, right? Because payments is a network at the end of the day. And there are, multiple players. Even, you think about, there are all these chicken and eggs that are embedded in any transaction, right? So if you look at the consumer merchant transaction, what comes first? You can digitize merchants, but unless you digitize consumers, the merchants don't have incentive to digitize, and vice versa. And like that, there are many such quandaries that need to be addressed. So what we are doing here is we've taken a single geography and we've coordinated a whole set of initiatives that very strategically and operationally drive the ecosystem. The other way to think about that is linking supply and demand, right? Because you have, on one hand, you have banks and now increasingly fintechs that are finding more ingenious ways of supplying financial products and services. On the other hand, you have, a massive need for demand creation, which includes awareness, capacity building, incentives and triggers to, kind of create compelling value propositions, desires or needs to move. That's pretty much it.
So right now we're kind of in the middle of you're sort of describing your ecosystem approach, which is really where I wanted to go next. Is there a way that you could walk us through, let's say, either using a particular individual or a merchant through what that ecosystem looks like? You were starting to do that, but the merchant needs to be digitized, but then the consumer needs to be digitized. So can you connect us with how Catalyst interacts there?
Let me tell you what, the way we are structured in, our different kind of areas of operation. So we basically have 4 engines of activity. Activity 1 is just what we call the lab. Jaipur, which is a second-tier city in India, roughly 3.5 million people, is our lab. And our goal is we've set up we have a set of initiatives and experiments and pilots to digitize the ecosystem. And we operate in a very rapid, iterative, test and learn kind of fashion where we, will run experiments and under each kind of, initiative and test our way through to a scalable business model. The second engine of activity is research. Now we have action learning that's already built into the lab, but here I'm talking about structured research where there is very little credible data around payment behavior, digital financial behavior when it comes to India. There's very strong policy imperatives and there have been massive tectonic shifts in terms of technology development. But that learning is key. And so we're working with a range of specialized learning and knowledge agencies from Glenbrook to SIGA at Berkeley, to Price, which is a Delhi-based think tank, to embed structured, rigorous research into our program. The third area of activity is what we call policy and partnerships. And that is all around. So we have about a convening platform of about 150 organizations globally, which include solution providers, including fintechs and banks, telcos, consumer brands, implementation agencies and NGOs, knowledge partners, development agencies, donors, etc. In addition, we have, and part of this kind of activity, we basically run a couple of forums to engage, right? So we have something called Finposiums, where we structure a Finposium around a real problem and real data from the ground, and then we have a debate typically that involves policymakers as well as innovators, and kind of bring them together to kind of try and answer some hard questions. We also have another forum called Roundtables, where a lot of this work, because of the ecosystem approach and the multiple chicken and eggs, even the solutioning requires collaboration. I mean, these are kind of multi-stakeholder collaborative solutions often that need to be co-created. And to do that, the Roundtable gives us basically, again, we start with a problem statement, we bring the right folks on the table, and then we develop solutions based on that. We just did something on this for one of our lab initiatives with IDEO, the design-centered outfit. So that's the third engine. The fourth engine then is what we call strategic innovations, and that really is when we believe that a model is scalable and strategically important to us, right? We kind of start productizing it, modeling it in a way that it's linked to us strategically in terms of our organization and also to our long-term sustainability. Those are the four engines of activity.
The question that's sort of in my brain right now, you were discussing bringing together, hundreds of organizations in your Finposiums, and the research aspect will definitely reach out to more and more organizations, not only in Jaipur, but around India, I'm sure. The question I'm wondering about is it your assumption or is it your thought that all of the parts are already in play and they just need to be connected? Or are there still real gaps in, for instance, the technology that's available and the policies that need to be crafted? Like, are there real structural changes that need to happen? Or is it a matter of, as you say, the pun, but you need to be the catalyst to bring them all together?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, this is, again, the Indian context is such, right? Because, payments and finance is a very kind of country-specific, context, right? But the Indian context is such that so on the policy front, there have been numerous initiatives that have been rolled out. We've had, for instance, liberalization of banks and banking licenses. We have different types of, we have small finance banks, we have payment banks. There's a whole lot of work around interoperability and getting non-banks to participate in the ecosystem. We have this program called Jan Dhan Yojana, which has created bank accounts for literally everybody. Many of them lie dormant, but they're still there. And then there's this other scheme called direct benefit transfers, where all sorts of subsidies, which used to be a massive leaking bucket for decades, now are being digitized slowly and reaching those bank accounts. So there's a whole kind of policy and technology architecture, right? So on the technology side, Aadhaar as the core biometric platform. Building on that, we just recently, about a few months ago, released what is called the Unified Payments Interface, which is really a bank-to-bank mobile-initiated payments transfer, right? You can send or you can collect. It's lower cost. It has a lot more functionality than anything else, and it's convenient.
That was something that you guys created, or that was?
Not at all. So these are fundamental platform technologies that have been developed. There's something called the India Stack, which has Aadhaar as an authentication layer. Then you have a DigiLocker, which, think about it as a Google Drive for India, right? In the public domain. And then you have UPI, which is the payments layer. And then you have the payments of the cashless layer. And then you have what they're working on now is an e-consent layer, which is all around data governance and putting control of data in the hands of the folks who own it, the users. So these are all kind of massive, both on the policy side as well as on the technology side. These are massive tectonic developments. But what is happening, the third leg of this stool, which is last mile digital transactions, are not happening. And they're not happening for many reasons. I think, we've broken them down into three, right? One is around, just having context appropriate products that truly create value and optimize for payment use cases, right? There are lots of products that there's a lot of innovation in the ecosystem that has happened. There are certainly products in wallets like Paytm, etc., that have, seen at least large scale adoption, if not usage. But I mean, when you think about payments, right, every use case is different. One has to kind of really think through these use cases, the context of those use cases, the needs, the sources of value, the pain points, and then build solutions. Maybe this is the next wave of innovation, but that's really what will drive adoption and use. So that's one piece, right? Just kind of the lack of compelling value propositions and value-based products and solutions. The second piece is economics, right? Where, I mean, cash is endemic. I mean, in India, at least given the large fraction of informality in the small, business sector, there is tax avoidance is pretty large. And so, when that's where you are at, the value of moving from cash to digital is not clear.
Right.
So again, it goes back to the first piece again, in terms of making sure that there's enough value that it outweighs some of the additional costs, right? Of course, there's also a cost. I mean, there is a cost of cash, but this is not something that is internalized. It's not.
I was just going to say, it's something that people have just been living with forever. And so it's just an accepted part of daily life, right? But when you walk up to them and say, hey, accept this new digital platform, and by the way, every transaction is going to cost you 10 rupees, it suddenly becomes tangible and real.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, there's another way to also look at it is there's a transitional component, right? So, I mean, even if you went to digital, it's not like you are going cold turkey from 100% cash to 100% digital. So in the interim, you are actually bearing costs on both sides, right? And that's an important, factor, right? When you actually get down to ground level operations. So there are all these, the economic factors that need to be addressed, and, payments really needs to be affordable. Business models need to be innovated upon where, the transaction layer itself is not necessarily being monetized, but, there are many other ways to monetize if you can really create value. And then the third barrier, the big barrier bucket, is behavior, which is again kind of like, I'm used to this, I know this, I don't know digital, I'm not sure I trust digital, this is my money, why should I do it, right? And that's where, a combination of communication, awareness, incentives, behavioral nudges, human-centered design techniques, right, to kind of get people to try. And trial then results in perceived or realized revealed value, and that leads to endorsement. And kind of pushing them along that journey is important.
You have just described just such an overwhelming problem, right? How do you wake up every day and go to your team and say, hey, let's tackle this one? Is there an 80% solution that you said, let's do this first? Or is there a level of merchant that you're addressing first?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's been very front and center for us. We're 9 months old, right? If I were to kind of take a cross section at every 3 months, we probably looked very different, right?
I'm sure you look nothing like you did 10 months ago before you opened your door.
No, exactly. So we have, what that means is we've innovated and evolved as an organization. That's the only way to do this. We've moved very fast and we've iterated. So let me tell you where we are now. So the other thing is that, the scale of the enormousness of so many different use cases, so many different types of barriers, so many stakeholders, all of that is absolutely true. That is exactly why we chose a single localized geography, which is the city of Jaipur. And we have an anchor operational partnership with the government of Rajasthan, which is the state government. Jaipur is the capital. And that kind of anchors this, right, in many ways, because it allows us to use our limited bandwidth to start, doing different things within Jaipur and launch these coordinated initiatives and tests within those initiatives to, start digitizing different pieces. Now, what specifically we're doing in Jaipur, and the evolution of this is, a lot of trial and error, but we're working in a couple of area ecosystems. So we're working in a dense market cluster, right, which is a congregation of about 800 stores across different sectors, different categories. We're also working in a low-income residential sector, essentially a slum, urban slum, which is much more household and residential focused. Right. And of course, there also you need to kind of, there are a set of anchor merchants that comprise, a fairly large fraction of the spend of these households, which also need to be part of that experiment, that whole initiative. Separately, we're working on two, let's call it federated merchant networks or ecosystems, right? So it's a different kind of ecosystem. One is dairy. So there are, there are dairy boards, and then you have, kind of, for example, 5,000 to 7,000 booths and parlors in Jaipur alone under that dairy board. Mm-hmm. Right. So now dairy is everybody buys milk, eggs, yogurt on a very high frequent basis. And the coverage of these transactions is very large. So dairy is one merchant network. The other is, a merchant network called eMitra, E-Mitra stands for e-friend. Mitra is friend in Hindi. E-Mitra is essentially, it's actually a digital governance platform rolled out by the government. These are entrepreneurs that run kiosks that sell or that disburse government services, and now increasingly private sector services. So you can pay your utility bill, you can get your Aadhaar account opened, etc., etc. Right? There are about roughly 400 services that are going through the E-Mitra network. Both dairy and E-Mitra, like I said, they have strong coverage and reach across vast number of households or population, and there are fairly frequent recurring use cases. So therefore, these are important use cases that address the merchant network, and through the merchant network, the broader kind of community from a consumer household standpoint. They're also both unique in the sense that they operate on razor thin margins. Financial margins.
Absolutely. Right? So you talk to any dairy producer in there, it's always a margin, right?
Yeah. So we're talking about 1% to 3% margins. So, and in India, these low margin businesses are everywhere. And so when you're talking about, think about a credit card transaction, for instance, right? I mean, even if on debit you have 50 basis points of 1%, if you're only earning a margin of like 3%, that is just it's not economical. And you would never, just economics wise, you would, be a big barrier. So, we are doing a lot of solution innovation here and rethinking business models to digitize, these merchants in a way that, makes sense. And part of that, could be, we're not there yet. We obviously want sustainable business models, but this could also be, potential case for a public subsidy because of the knock-on effect, right? In terms of, if you think of the overall cost benefit of, kind of reduced cash transactions and all, the downstream effects, etc. And, the subsidy amount, it's dwarfed by the, cost.
Speaking of cost, when Catalyst was founded, did you put together your own pool of money? How are you moving this forward? What's your funding base to take this forward? Is it banks? Is it financial institutions?
So today, our core funding base is USAID. And USAID has been involved in India on, the issue of digital payments and financial inclusion for a good 3-4 years now. They, had partnered with the Ministry of Finance. And that, led to a first phase of work during which they did some research and set up some, standalone pilots, and then came to the conclusion that the best use of these funds would be to seed an organization that can take this forward. And that's how Catalyst was germinated. We're housed in IFMR LEAD, which is a Chennai-based research think tank. And we have our own project charter and, kind of our own setup. Even though we're not a legal entity today, we're sort of been incubated as such with the vision that we can chart our own sustainability course.
So I love this that we're talking to you, less than a year old. So, you're still figuring out who you are in a lot of ways, as we've been describing now. Can you give us a vision as the CEO of what do you think things look like 2 or 3 years from now? Do you have viable solutions in place? Has Jaipur been essentially digitized and you're now looking to scale some of those solutions, or is there a longer horizon than that?
Yeah, no, I would say, 3, 4, 5 years from now, India will look very different than it is today. We would have hopefully very significantly contributed to, ground level, tangible learnings that would, have impact that is much bigger than just Jaipur, because everything we do, we put it in the public domain, and, we work with partners that have, kind of massive reach and scale. So we just, through our iterative lean test and learn kind of and validate approach, we kind of build business and operational models that then can be institutionalized and scaled. Now, in some of those scaling activities, we will play a part, but we will choose those strategically based on who we want to be. So, for example, we're rolling out an incubator focused on, it's titled FinTech for the Last Mile. And the whole premise of the incubator is to fund a set of visionary entrepreneurs that are building payments plus products, right? And when I say payments plus, I mean payments, but then, a value added layer on top, right, that addresses a very unique use case, like I mentioned earlier. And we're working with a whole set of ecosystem partners that are relevant in this journey. But our real our unique kind of value add compared to, many incubators that already exist is that we can plug them into Jaipur in an app, in a real operational context, link them to our existing infrastructure in terms of operations, research and analytics infrastructure, et cetera, help them, kind of cross the chasm, hopefully in the course of 6 months and with, 50,000 dollars to spend.
So give me an example of an organization with massive reach. Are you talking about an established bank? Are you talking about a government ministry or?
Absolutely. So I'll give you a couple of examples on the private sector side and then also on the public sector side. So on private sector, we're working with, for example, Axis Bank. Axis is a private sector bank that is fairly innovative and leading edge in terms of on the digital front. So we're working with them around kind of buy-sided incentives. So looking at, kind of incentives both from the merchant side as well as the consumer side. So, this is Axis Bank and Visa, right? And if we can jumpstart and catalyze something in Jaipur, and if it works, and let's say there's a fixed term, the incentives hold for X months, and after you pull them back off, there is some, sustained behavior change. That is something that they can then take across the country, right? Because they see that they have the reach and the power and the arsenal to do that. We are working with Capital Float in the context of a USAID credit guarantee program. Capital Float is one of the leading digital lenders in India, and we're looking at an alternative flow-based credit model where credit becomes a hook for digital payments, right? So if you're a small merchant and you want a loan, the proposition is that, hey, you come onto a digital platform and you get a loan to start with. And then not only you don't stop there, but you get a top up, right? Or a follow-on loan based on certain milestones, both in terms of having repaid the previous loan, but also having clocked certain number of digital transactions, right? So that you're also inducing usage. And through that, if you think of that just, the way it goes forward, you slowly kind of, build credit and you kind of find your way through the formal, financial ecosystem, and there's always upside. So that is, again, where, we're looking to do a few tests and pilots. We're actually, this is something that the University of Berkeley has a research consortium called SIGA, and we're working with some University of Berkeley and Merced researchers to look to rigorously, also test this model in a rigorous experimental fashion. We'll get some actual data and analysis out of that, right? But it is a model that if it works in Jaipur across a significant sample or base of merchants, then it's something that can be rolled out. It's a credit model that can be rolled out anywhere.
Do you find that in the context of not only Jaipur, but in India in general, that what you're doing is sort of being welcomed generally? Or do you find that there's a significant resistance from, established players, for lack of a better term, established policy players, established financial players, etc.?
Yeah, so I think, the answer is actually mixed. So yes, from the standpoint of anything in digital payments and digital finance today in India is, important because there's a policy imperative. Everybody's kind of working around it. The government has set a target of 25 billion transactions, digital transactions, to be clocked in the current fiscal. And, that has created a general, kind of urgency to do something here. Now, where it flips is the patience and, kind of an openness to our approach sometimes, right? Because we firmly believe that this is such a fundamentally complex and behavioral problem in many ways that you need to learn your way through. And to learn your way through, if you go for scale and you don't have the right business or operational model, you're scaling something that does not work. It's a waste of money. So, but on the other hand, when you're testing and iterating, right, it's a different approach. It's more human-centered. You can kind of, do A/B testing. You can reach that scalable validation of a business model, but that requires some time. So when in our conversations with both, particularly policymakers, but also some of the established players, that often becomes, that is something that is, a conversation, and it takes some time to, bring them, to align them, with this innovation, this innovative test and learn kind of approach.
Badal, this conversation is like many on this show where I feel like we could probably talk for the next 2 or 3 hours, especially going down into some of the rabbit holes that you've described about serving the last mile of consumers. But I have 2 questions for you that I ask everyone on this series to conclude our interview here. The first one is, who do you pay attention to? You're the CEO of a new organization, but I've looked at your history, and you're a guy who's connected. You've been out there. Are there blog feeds, Twitter handles, magazines, newspapers that you pay attention to not only keep up to date, but to maybe continue your evolution as catalyst and make sure you're going in the right direction that you think others should know about?
Sure. So I'd say inspiration users, right? At the end of the day, like I said, a lot of this is understanding the need, the creativities, the coping mechanisms, the opportunities, the moments of truth that govern the lives of users, small merchants and low to mid-income consumers. So unless you, just understanding who you are building, whatever you're building for, is the first place, and inevitably we're surprised. There's revelation there, there is surprise there's possibilities, there are frustrations. But that is one radar that I always keep open, and so does, I think, most of my team. Another is, they're global innovators, right? So, it's not one archetype, but it's, there are a whole set of very exciting innovators in India that are building value and interesting new products and solutions on top of, some of the foundational layers that I mentioned earlier. But I think there are also a whole host of global experts, because in many ways, India is, leading the way in digital payments, but some of these experiments have happened elsewhere, like Africa, for instance. If you look at digital credit and payments, and you look at the Kenya example, M-Pesa and then M-Shwari, the whole set of organizations that have gotten spawned, there's a lot of activity there. So that's an area where we look for inspiration and benchmarks and best practices. Similarly, there are other scattered experiments across, right? And a lot of them ladder up to, innovation centers or hubs or organizations in the US. So whether it's, I mentioned IDEO, there are others like Glenbrook, all of these folks are the World Bank and IFC have a compendium of interesting, case studies and examples, etc. So we have a very extensive and collaborative network of partners. And I think that is certainly one of the biggest sources of innovation, new thoughts and ideas for us.
So the last question I have for you, and I'm wondering if there is a specific technology or a specific shiny new object or process or thing that you're personally excited about, doesn't even have to be related to fintech, that you think is going to be important for people in need, that deserves a shout out, or that you don't think is getting enough press right now that you'd like to highlight here?
Yeah, I don't know if it's getting enough press or not, but I think the biggest game-changing and exciting developments in India is around these new payment platforms. And so the Unified Payments Interface is one that I mentioned. There's another one which recently so that's called UPI. And then there is another one called Aadhaar Pay, which is, based on biometrics, right? So there, if a consumer does not have forget a smartphone, they don't have a phone, they can still make a payment through their biometrics. Both of these are also challenges, but these are huge game-changing technologies. And I think, what we're doing, how it links up to us and why it's particularly exciting is that we're at ground zero of a network build, right? And like any network development, the first you have to get the early adopters, and they're all driven by intrinsic motivation because the network value has not really kicked in, right? As you bring those change agents and they digitize and they, develop and contribute to the network, slowly the network value emerges, and then that takes over and it becomes kind of, you hit that inflection point and then you move forward. So we're actually recreating that experiment or that very process in Jaipur. We have an initiative that, fundamentally think of it as an initiative that is a call to action to recruit youth or young people who we think are the best targets for this, to onboard and digitize their communities. And so we're addressing different ecosystems, universities, aggregator networks, tight-knit, low-income residential communities, etc. And there is a platform approach to this where, it's about communication, it's about training, it's about incentives and gamification, it's about analytics, right? But we apply that across these different ecosystems and drive the network. So it's literally kind of, it's a laboratory exercise, right? But it's incredibly exhilarating, and it's powering a new network based on a very compelling and powerful technology that has a lot of promise for the future.
Badal, again, I wish you all the luck. This sounds like such a fantastic experiment that you're undertaking now, and I'm excited to check back in with you, a year or two from now to see how it's turned out.
That'd be fantastic. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for featuring Catalyst on your program.
Hey guys, can you take 30 seconds and give the show a rating on iTunes or whatever podcast app you happen to be using? And if you really enjoyed the show, share it with others on Facebook or Twitter. And of course, you can always contact me at aidpreneur.com. Thanks.